Texas Democrat Al Green is a member of the Congressional Black Caucus, and he is the man you just saw speaking there. Thank you for being here tonight, sir. Let me start with this. On the night that the Ferguson grand jury released its findings, the Congressional Black Caucus chair released a statement that read in part as follows. This decision seems to underscore an unwritten rule that black lives hold no value, that you may kill black men in this country without consequences or repercussions. Do you agree with that?
Thank you for having me on the program. I respect law enforcement, and I also want to let you know that I respect people who peacefully protest, and in your earlier segment you showed some of the things that happened that were quite dastardly done. I do not respect those who engage in dastardly deeds, and I think people who commit crimes ought to be prosecuted. With that said, I think that we have to recognize that there has been for many years, probably before you and I were born, Ms. Kelly, black people who have been prosecuted and persecuted in this country. And no one says today that all of that prosecution and persecution is no longer occurring. Correct,
but that doesn't answer the question, because there have been statements made about this particular case that seem to many to be beyond the pale, including that the decision by the grand jury not to indict this police officer under these circumstances underscores an unwritten rule that black lives have no value and that you may kill black men in this country without consequence. I mean, do you stand by that?
Well, I think that it does happen with impunity in some cases.
Well, what about in this case?
I think, well, let's talk about this case. I'm pleased that you decided to do so. I think that in this case, we have a basic premise that has not been applied, and that is, it is not enough for things to be right, they must also look right. And in this case, it doesn't look right for a prosecutor to take this case to a grand jury when he could have taken it to a judge. He could have had a preliminary hearing, and at that preliminary hearing we would have had total transparency and the world would have been able to see what occurred. I think that would have been the better course of conduct to pursue, because it's not enough for things to be right, they must also look right. And the perception can exist when you take things behind closed doors that you're engaging in a process that is not fair.
Well, grand jury proceedings are secret. I mean, that's just the way it goes, and they're used in many cases. But let me ask you this, because one of the things that we learned from the prosecutor,
because that comment requires a response.
Well, listen, I mean, the grand jury proceeding was an extra. In many cases, the prosecutor would have said, I'm not charging, and that's the end of it.
You don't have to go there. This prosecutor didn't have to go there. He could have said, I'm not charging, and that's the end of the matter. Well, he could have, and that would have been wrong, too.
Okay, let me ask you this, because one of the problems in this case is that the actual evidence that was presented to said grand jury is being largely ignored by these protesters who were seeing with the hands up, don't shoot. Okay, because the evidence in front of that grand jury was not that Michael Brown came up with his hands up saying don't shoot. That was not the evidence. And I want to just show you what the evidence was. These are African-American witnesses. African-American witnesses who testified before the grand jury, who testified, and I'll just give you a couple samples. One, Mike Brown continuously came forward in the charging motion, and at one point, he started to slow down, he came to a stop, and when he stopped, that's when the officer ceased fire, and Mike Brown started to charge once more at him, and the officer returned fire. Witness number two, another African-American witness. Then Michael turned around and started charging towards the officer, and the officer still yelling, stop. He did have his firearm drawn, but he was yelling, stop, stop, stop. He didn't. So he started shooting him. And here's a third. I thought he was trying to charge at him first, because the only thing I kept saying was, is he crazy? Why don't he just stop instead of running? Because if somebody's pulling a gun on you, first thing I would think is to drop down on the ground. That was the evidence that the grand jury heard.
That was not all of the evidence that the grand jury heard.
That's enough, sir, to say there is no probable cause to charge somebody.
That is not enough. Not if you have other evidence from several witnesses who had statements that were antithetical to those statements.
You get to make a balance. It's a 51% standard, and it didn't go your way. Why can't you accept that?
Who indicated that his hands were up. You had other witnesses who indicated that he was not charging. You had other witnesses who said things that were totally different from what you read.
Every witness who testified he was charging was African-American. How is this a race thing?
You're only going to present a side that seems to favor the prosecution.
Every witness who testified he was charging the cop was African-American.
But there were other witnesses, and you're avoiding what those other witnesses said.
And you're avoiding these witnesses.
By doing that, what you're doing is creating the appearance of only three witnesses with credibility.
I'm not, sir.
Yes,
because
you are.
No, I'm
And you
not.
shouldn't do
Because
that,
it doesn't
Megyn.
have to be open and shut. The grand jury has to
You
find
shouldn't do that.
by
You
51%
shouldn't
that
do
they
that.
think that a charge should be brought. I'm giving you the evidence that would justify the decision, saying it's just not there. And the thing
No,
that,
but what you're doing
but let me just
is
ask you the question. I'll give you the floor. I'm going to give you the floor.
Evidence,
I'm going to give you the
and
floor.
conflicting evidence
I get
only
that.
indicates that you can have something sent to a jury and you can have a question of fact
They don't
resolved by
just
a jury.
because there's conflicting
And
evidence
that
doesn't
could
mean it
have
has to
been
go to a
done.
jury.
But
Doesn't
it
have
was
to.
not done. It was not done in this case. He did not take it to a preliminary hearing. He could have taken it before a judge. That would have been total transparency, and the
I
world
got
would
that.
have
You
been
made
able
that
to
point.
hear those other witnesses
that
that
point.
you are not bringing up.
But you know
You're
what?
telling one side of the story, and you're doing your
made that
viewers a
point.
disservice
No,
by
I'm not.
doing that.
Listen, they've heard that. They've heard that
You
repeatedly.
only
Here on
want
this.
to hear,
All right,
you
sir.
only want
Now
to
it's my
present the
turn.
prosecutor's side.
Now
That
it's
is a
my
mistake.
turn.
That
Now
is
it's my
not
turn.
what you should do. You should be fair and balanced.
Listen, now it's my turn. How is it about race when every witness who testified Michael Brown was charging that cop was African American?
Well, because African Americans can make mistakes too.
All of them? All 6 of them?
Well, what about all of the others who said that he wasn't?
But were they racially motivated? They were trying to
Well,
set
why
up
are African Americans only racially motivated, Megyn?
Okay, so they're racist too.
No,
Sir,
I'm not saying anybody's racist. You said that. You're bringing race into this.
You
I'm
are.
saying to you
You're part of the
that
Congressional
when,
Black
no, you're
Caucus.
doing it,
They're
and
the
you would
ones
like
who
to attribute
released the
it to me.
statement that
But
black
you
lives have
cannot
no
give one
value
side of a
and you can kill
story
black men
and
with
expect
impunity.
it to become the truth. You're not doing that properly. You have to let both sides be heard. And if both sides are heard and you have conflicting evidence, a good prosecutor gets an indictment and then he takes that to a trial.
On this show and this channel, unlike any other, you get both sides.
On this show and this channel, you should be fair and balanced.
We are. And here you get both sides, unlike the other places where you only hear from the Ferguson protesters.
Read the statement.